Hello, and welcome to Western Washington History. With this story, as with most stories from history, there is conflicting information. I tried to go to newspaper articles and other media printed at the time to verify and was able to do that with most parts of this story. What I found, as I have found before, is the main articles that are copied over and over online are not accurate. The Kenworth story begins in 1905, not in Western Washington, but Western Oregon. Never fear, we will be back across the border in Washington soon. I just want to give some background. Brothers George, Louis, and Edward Gerlinger started a car dealership in Portland known as Stoddard Dayton Auto Company. The name changed in 1913 to Gerlinger Motor Car Works. Gerlinger had 5 employees and rented a 2-story building at 690 Washington Street in Portland, Oregon. There is also an ad with the address 694 Washington Street, so maybe they eventually rented both buildings. George Gerlinger was president of the Willamette Lumber Company, which turned into Willamette Industries, a massive logging and mill operation that the brothers' dad had started. Their dad also built the Gerlinger building in Portland. Louis was president of Salem Falls and Western Railway, a logging railroad based in Salem, Oregon that was part of the Willamette mill operation. Their younger brother Edward was vice president and general manager of the company. Gerlinger Motor Car was a distributor of other car and truck brands of the time. 3 of them that we found information on are Stoddard Dayton cars, which were manufactured from 1905 to 1913, then became part of Chrysler. Chandler cars, which were made from 1913 to 1929, they were bought by Hupp Motor Car, maker of the classic Hupp Mobile. They were bought just for their factory and the Chandler was discontinued. Lastly, they sold Federal trucks, which were made from 1910 to 1960. They were bought by NAPCO, who made 4x4 units and winches as well as other accessories. NAPCO discontinued the truck line. Eventually, NAPCO sold the 4x4 division to Dana. Other brands they sold were Pathfinder, Holly, Oakland, and Vim delivery vans. In 1913, they opened another dealership in Seattle at 1432 Broadway Street. They continued to sell other manufacturers' cars and trucks and were barely making the bills, with possible layoffs on the horizon. A mechanic, J.E. Hahn, brought up the idea to build a truck of their own. He knew the limitations of the Federal brand truck and felt that he could make a much better vehicle more suited to the rugged Pacific Northwest. Shop foreman George Peters was put in charge of the project. They called their truck the Gersix, which was a combination of the names Gerlinger and Six, because they put a 6-cylinder engine in their truck in place of the 4-cylinder found in the Federal as well as other trucks of the time. The engine was made by Continental. The main reason they went with the inline 6 was that due to popularity, the 4-cylinder was hard to come by at that point. That little change made a big difference in power. That wasn't the only thing that made them stand out ahead of the Federal. They also used all structural steel in their trucks, where others used a wood frame or pressed steel, which was weaker. The rear axle was a worm gear type, a very strong but slow design. These trucks were not recommended over 20 miles an hour and would void the warranty if you had driven it faster. Some of the other trucks were using a ring and pinion style rear axle, which were not as strong but outlived the worm drive style as they are used in most rear-wheel drive vehicles today. They only made one model at this point, and it was rated to carry 2.5 tons. The Gersix was stronger and more powerful in most every way. It sounds like they had many dealerships they were running at this time. There was one mentioned in San Francisco, although I couldn't find how many they had in total. By at least 1914, the owners told the local dealers that they would take time payments and that they would carry the risk of default as the individual dealers were carrying it up until this point, and less likely to make a time payment sale. The first Gersix was finished and sold in 1915 to a brick hauling company. The Gersix sold for $2,500. When they sold their second truck, they attracted the attention of a furniture manufacturer based in Tacoma. He offered them a building in Tacoma for stock in their company. So in 1916, Gerlinger Motor Company opened a new shop at 2011 5th Street in Tacoma. Also that year, they moved to a new Seattle location at the intersection of Fairview and Valley Streets. At this point, they were using 6-cylinder Wisconsin engines, 3-speed manual transmission, Stromberg carburetor, and the truck itself weighed 5,000 pounds. They also came out with the universal tractor in 1915. The tractor was an attachment you could put onto your car you already own. It would provide gear reduction as well as tractor wheels. Then when you're done, you just turned it back into a car. In 1917, they had the shop in Portland, San Francisco, Seattle, and Tacoma, and who knows where else. Maybe that spread them too thin, or maybe selling trucks on time payments wasn't working out. Whatever the case was, the Gerlinger Motor Car Company filed for bankruptcy. Edward Gerlinger sold the company for $75,000, built a 3-story building on Park Street in Portland for $20,000, and started selling Selden trucks from New York. His brothers continued to run the lumber operation. I'm not sure how much involvement they had in the truck company. Edgar Worthington and Captain Frederick Keene bought the failing company. Recently, they had made a lot of money with their partnership in the company Washington Dock and Barge. Edgar was the manager of his mom's commercial property in Seattle, where the Gerlingers had their Seattle dealership. He also had a decent-sized logging company. This was the same year World War I started and parts became hard to come by. They would have to resort to 4-cylinder Buda engines and the occasional Wisconsin-made 6-cylinder. During the war, Gersix would sell a small amount of military trucks to Japan, who was helping to fight the Germans. The brakes were bad in these old trucks. One old-timer said that they would drag a log behind him down hills to help slow the truck down. The brakes would fade and you would have to use low gear to not completely smoke the brakes. In 1919, the focus shifted to Seattle, having sold less than 100 trucks while in Tacoma. By now, the 65-year-old Captain Keene was ready to retire. A younger Worthington investment associate, Harry Kent, along with William Balcom and T.M. Jenner, would buy his shares in the company. Harry Kent was vice president and treasurer of Todd Dry Dock in Seattle. 1924, the Gersix factory had 35 employees. The newspaper wrote an article saying all parts of the truck were from the Northwest except the engine, transmission, and rear axle. Here's a small side note. The Gerlinger brothers' Uncle Carl started Gerlinger Carrier Company in 1918. Carl was a mechanic and had been in a steam boiler explosion in 1908 that killed his younger brother and took his arm off at the elbow, as well as took fingers from his other hand. He was blind from the explosion for a small time and then regained his sight. Knowing he could not work in his chosen profession, he set out to work with his inventions. A whole video could be made on this guy, but this is Western Washington, not Oregon. His business built tractors and straddle carriers. Caterpillar eventually bought him out. Over time, his family got the straddle carrier part of the business back, and it runs it to this day in Dallas, Oregon. Okay, back to Kenworth. Worthington and Kent did away with the Tacoma location and focused on Seattle, but still had a repair shop in Portland. The Seattle location was at the intersection of Fairview Avenue and Valley Street, and now called the Gersix Manufacturing Company. Kent was mostly a financial partner, with Worthington being more involved in the operations of the business. Production climbed up each year, with 56 Gersix trucks being made in 1922. Edgar Worthington, along with Harry Kent, incorporated the business in 1923. The name was changed at this time to Kenworth Motor Truck Company, a combination of the names of the two biggest stockholders of the company. They moved that year to 506 Mercer Street, Seattle. In a year, they had sold 80 Kenworth trucks. The 6-cylinder was replaced with the Buda 4-cylinder. The customers had a lot of artistic control over the early trucks, as they were all custom built. An early philosophy was build the right Kenworth truck for each customer's application and build the truck to last. By 1925, Kenworth had 5 standard models to choose from. They offered load ranges from 1 to 5 tons. Kenworth was making buses by 1926, mostly sold to school districts in the Puget Sound area. Also in 1927, production had jumped to 3 vehicles being produced per week. That year, Kenworth makes its first J6, a Canadian 3-ton truck made in British Columbia at the Vancouver Engineering Works. The top-of-the-line model in 1927 could get you a 6-cylinder with a 7-speed transmission and a whopping 78 horsepower. In 1929, Kenworth opened a new facility in Seattle at 1263 Mercer Street. The building was 120 feet by 240 feet and had a service department, showroom, and offices. They could produce 50 trucks per month. Kenworth trucks were built there until 1946. This same year, Edgar Worthington retires. In 1932, Kenworth started making fire trucks. Once again, their ability to customize made them more likely to get customers over their competitors. 1933 brought many new innovations to the truck market. Kenworth designed and added the first sleeper cab. They were also the first domestic truck company to make the diesel engines their standard engine. Of course, they'd been putting diesels in since the Gersix days. The first diesels going in Kenworth trucks were Cummins HA4 100 horsepower 4-cylinders. Also this year, Kenworth was the first truck to put smokestacks on for the exhaust pipe. The call for innovation came again in 1935 with the passage of the Motor Carrier Act by the U.S. government. They added hydraulic brakes in their first 6-wheel drive trucks. With the passage of the act, for the first time, trucks and trailers were imposed with weight and length limits. Kenworth designed lighter springs and suspension as well as aluminum cabs and hubs. The cab-over or bubble-nose Kenworth cab was first built in 1936, called the Model 519. Some were turned off by its looks, but the design had a purpose. It would allow for a slightly longer trailer and still fit into the government's regulations. Slightly longer means slightly more cargo. At this point, their weight rating went from 2 to 10-ton trucks. Now they were using Hercules, Herschel Spillman, and Buda gas engines as well as Cummins diesel engines. Harry Kent has a heart attack and passes away in 1937. Former president of Boeing Airplane Company and United Airlines, Philip Johnson, takes over as president of Kenworth. The 500 series comes out in 1939 and is later nicknamed Needle Nose. They sell many of these into the 1940s and become known as the truck that can haul what others can't. In January of 1942, just 1 month after Pearl Harbor attack, Kenworth was building for Uncle Sam. They built nearly 2,000 M1 tank retriever wreckers. These could carry 4 tons and were 6-wheel drive, or 6x6 as they were called. These trucks were built to work, with multiple winches, a welder, tools, and front and rear cranes. They built a plant at the Yakima Fairgrounds and built some of these there at that time due to the Puget Sound being too close proximity to the water. They also helped in other areas of the war effort. They had an aircraft plant where they built Boeing B-17 and B-29 parts. They had been building these trucks in stalls, truck by truck, until the war. With the war, Kenworth was introduced to the assembly line process and implemented it for a much better output. This would serve them well after the war. They also learned a lot about working with aluminum, which also allowed them to create the first aluminum frame rail truck. Once again, tragedy hits Kenworth in 1944 as the president, Philip Johnson, has a stroke and passes away. Pacific Car and Foundry, or PACCAR, bought the company in 1945. Kenworth would once again move when PACCAR bought the Fisher Body Plant near Boeing Field on East Marginal Way in 1946 to manufacture its Kenworth trucks. This plant had chain conveyors to pull the trucks along as they were being built. Kenworth would be at this spot for the next 50 years. This is where we will end this video, as the rest of the story will be in a video devoted to PACCAR, or possibly in another Kenworth video covering PACCAR's acquisition of Kenworth through to the present day. Thank you for once again spending some time with us. I hope it was informative, and if you receive value from this information, please like the video. If you like these types of history videos, then please think about subscribing to the channel, and if you really want to help out, become a member. Share these videos with people you know who would love to see this information. We are all history warriors. It's up to us to keep it alive. Until next time, remember, what you do today will be history tomorrow, so make it count.